In 1443, a Korean king locked himself in a room and invented an alphabet. Not commissioned it, not assigned scholars to develop it. He did it himself. King Sejong the Great, one of the most brilliant rulers in Asian history, personally designed a writing system so logical, so phonetically precise, and so easy to learn, that linguists today call it one of the greatest intellectual achievements in the history of human language. The alphabet he created, Hangul, can be learned by an adult in a few hours. Korean children become literate faster than children learning any other major writing system in the world. The same alphabet that Sejong designed in 1443 is what 52 million South Koreans use today. And yet, the dynasty that produced this invention, the Joseon dynasty, which ruled the Korean peninsula for 505 years, was so politically paralyzed by factional warfare among its own scholar officials that it could not respond effectively when Japan invaded in 1592, could not modernize fast enough when Japan returned in the 19th century, and ended in 1897 not with a battle, but with a diplomatic document signed under duress by a king whose government had already been hollowed out from within. Archaeologists excavating the palace archives at Gyeongbokgung in Seoul have recovered diplomatic correspondence showing that the dynasty's final collapse was predicted, in writing, by its own officials, decades before it happened. They saw it coming. They could not stop it. So how does a civilization that invented movable metal type 200 years before Gutenberg end up unable to defend itself against the country it once taught to read? The Joseon dynasty did not emerge from a military coup in any simple sense. It emerged from the collapse of an ideology, the exhaustion of a governing philosophy that had sustained the Goryeo dynasty for nearly 5 centuries, and whose internal contradictions had finally become too large to ignore. The Goryeo dynasty, which ruled Korea from 918 to 1392, had been built around a synthesis of Buddhist religious authority and aristocratic political power, whose combination had once been productive, but whose later centuries were marked by the specific dysfunction that tends to follow when religious institutions accumulate economic and political influence beyond their capacity to sustain it responsibly. Buddhist monasteries in late Goryeo Korea had become major landowners. Taxpayers, by precedent, were exempt from the taxation that fell on ordinary farmers, and the wealth flowing into monastic institutions was creating a class of politically connected religious elites whose interests frequently conflicted with those of the farmers and soldiers who actually sustained the state. Yi Song-ye, the general who would found the Joseon dynasty, was a military commander of genuine ability, who had built his reputation through successful campaigns against the Japanese pirates raiding Korea's coastline and against the Mongol remnants threatening from the north. His political opportunity came from a specific military crisis. In 1388, the Goryeo king ordered an invasion of China's newly established Ming dynasty, which Yi Seong-ye considered strategically disastrous. He turned his army around at the Weihua Island in the Yalu River, the famous Weihua Island Retreat, and marched it back to the capital, where he initiated the political process that would end Goryeo and begin Joseon. The intellectual framework that justified this transition was Neo-Confucianism, the reformed Confucian philosophy that had developed in Song dynasty China and that a generation of Korean scholars had been studying, translating, and applying to Korean political conditions. Where Buddhism had provided the ideological framework for Goryeo governance, Neo-Confucianism would provide the framework for Joseon. And the differences between them were not merely philosophical. They had direct political and economic consequences. Neo-Confucianism, in its Korean application, emphasized the moral responsibility of rulers to govern for the benefit of their subjects, the importance of meritocratic examination systems rather than hereditary privilege for government appointments, the subordination of religious authority to political ethics, and the cultivation of learning as the foundation of good governance. These principles were not simply idealistic abstractions. They provided the intellectual justification land reforms that Yi Seong-gai and his allies implemented to break the economic power of the Buddhist monasteries, the civil service examination system that would define Joseon's administrative structure for 5 centuries, and the specific form of scholarly governance that gave the dynasty its distinctive character. The choice of Hanyang, the city now known as Seoul, as the new dynasty's capital was not arbitrary. The site in the Han River Valley, surrounded by mountains on 3 sides, with the river providing both a southern barrier and a commercial artery, represented the best available combination of defensive geography and commercial connectivity on the Korean peninsula. The feng shui considerations that the court's geomancers apply to the site selection were simultaneously cultural convention and practical strategic assessment. The specific configuration of mountains and water that feng shui principles associated with auspicious governance corresponded, in fact, to defensive and agricultural advantages that would have made the site attractive to any military planner, regardless of metaphysical framework. The reign of King Sejong the Great, who ruled from 1418 to 1450, and who is regarded by historians of Korea as the most accomplished monarch in the dynasty's 505-year history, represents the Joseon dynasty at its most ambitious and its most creative, a period during which royal patronage and personal intellectual engagement combined to produce achievements that changed Korean civilization permanently. Sejong came to the throne at 21, the 3rd son of King Sejong, having been chosen as crown prince over his older brothers on the basis of his evident intellectual gifts. His reign began with a specific recognition of a problem that had troubled Korean governance since the peninsula's first contact with Chinese writing. The Korean language and the Chinese writing system were so linguistically incompatible that literacy in Chinese, the official written language of the Korean state, was effectively limited to the educated elite who could afford the years of study required to master it. Ordinary Koreans, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, soldiers, had no practical access to the written word. The script that Sejong created, working by all accounts with substantial personal involvement rather than simply directing scholars to undertake the project, was designed on explicitly phonological principles. Hangul represents the sounds of spoken Korean with a consistency and precision that the Chinese character system, designed for a fundamentally different language, could never achieve. The consonant shapes were designed according to the explanatory document Hunminjeongeum that Sejong issued in 1446 to reflect the shape of the speech organs when producing each sound, a linguistic theory that modern phonetics confirms is broadly accurate. The vowel shapes were based on cosmological principles derived from Neo-Confucian philosophy, heaven, earth, and humanity, but their practical function was to create a small, learnable inventory of vowel symbols that combined systematically with the consonant symbols to represent any syllable in the Korean language. The opposition that Hangul encountered from the Confucian scholarly establishment, the Jifyeon scholars who had helped develop it, but whose colleagues outside the Royal Academy saw the new script as a threat to the Chinese-based literary culture that defined their status, reveals the political stakes of literacy reform. If ordinary people could read and write, the specific advantage that years of Chinese literary education provided to the scholarly class would be diluted. The conservative scholars' arguments were framed in cultural and intellectual terms. Chinese writing connected Korea to the civilizational heritage of China. A separate Korean script would isolate the country from that heritage. But the underlying concern was the democratization of knowledge and what it would mean for the social hierarchy that classical Chinese education sustained. Sejong's scientific interests were equally remarkable. The Zhang Yongsil, a court scientist of low social birth, whom Sejong promoted to positions of unusual authority, developed under royal patronage a series of scientific instruments, including the Chugugi, a standardized rain gauge whose systematic deployment across the country in 1441 represents the first known national network of precipitation measurement anywhere in the world. The celestial globes and astronomical instruments developed during Sejong's reign drew on a combination of Chinese astronomical tradition and original Korean observation that produced calendar calculations of exceptional accuracy. The Korean peninsula's geography, a mountainous backbone running north-south with river valleys connecting the coast to the interior and the sea on three sides, shaped the Joseon state's political organization, military capabilities, and cultural identity in ways that were direct and consequential. The Taebaek mountain range, which runs the length of the peninsula's eastern edge, divides Korea into two distinct zones: the relatively narrow eastern coastal plain, where fishing communities and smaller agricultural settlements were concentrated, and the broader western and southern lowlands, where the major agricultural regions, river systems, and urban centers developed. The mountains themselves were not simply obstacles. They were strategic assets, creating defensible positions that could hold against larger forces, and cultural resources, associated in Korean imagination and religious practice with spiritual power and national identity in ways that shaped everything from military tactics to poetry. The Han River, flowing westward from the central mountains through the capital region to the Yellow Sea, was the economic artery of the Joseon state. Grain, timber, stone, and manufactured goods moved along its waters, and the city of Seoul's growth from a mid-sized administrative center to a metropolis of several 100,000 people by the 18th century was sustained by this river-based supply system. The management of the river's flooding, which could devastate the agricultural lowlands when monsoon rains were exceptionally heavy, was one of the perennial administrative challenges of Joseon governance, and the hydraulic engineering solutions developed during the dynasty's long history represent an underappreciated technological achievement. The Yangban, the scholar official class, whose members passed the civil service examinations and staffed the dynasty's administrative apparatus, were the defining social institution of Joseon Korea in a way that had no precise equivalent in other East Asian dynasties. In China, the examination system produced a meritocratic bureaucracy recruited from across the social spectrum. In Joseon Korea, the examinations were formally open to all free men, but practically restricted to the sons of families with the wealth and social connections to provide the years of classical education that examination success required. The Yangban were not a hereditary aristocracy in the strict sense. Status required continuous educational investment and examination success to maintain. But they functioned as one in practice, with Yangban families intermarrying, maintaining their documentation of lineage, and transmitting educational advantage across generations. The proliferation of Confucian academies, the Seowon, across the Korean countryside during the dynasty's middle period created a distributed educational infrastructure that was, per capita, probably denser than anywhere else in the pre-modern world. These academies, typically established in scenic mountain locations in honor of a venerated Confucian scholar, and maintained by local Yangban families, provided both formal education and the social networking functions that examination success depended on. Their concentration in certain regions created geographic patterns of Yangban influence that shaped local politics, land tenure, and cultural production for generations. The first century of Joseon governance, approximately from the dynasty's founding in 1392 through the reign of Sejong to the mid-15th century, was a period of institutional construction and technological development, whose achievements defined the dynasty's administrative structure for the following 4 centuries, and whose scientific innovations were, in several cases, genuinely ahead of anything available in the contemporary world. The most significant administrative achievement of the early dynasty was the consolidation and systematization of the civil service examination system, the Gwajo, as the primary pathway to government appointment. The examinations tested mastery of the Confucian classics, historical knowledge, and literary composition in the Chinese style, and their successful completion was the formal prerequisite for appointment to the central and provincial administration. The system was not perfectly meritocratic. Yangban family connections, access to expensive private tutors, and the social capital accumulated through academic networks all provided advantages that the formal examination structure did not eliminate. But the principle that government appointment required demonstrated scholarly competence rather than simply family connection was consistently maintained, and the pressure it created for educational investment shaped Korean culture in ways whose consequences are still visible in contemporary South Korea's extraordinary emphasis on educational attainment. The agricultural reforms of the early dynasty addressed the fundamental problem of land concentration that had contributed to Goryeo collapse. A comprehensive land survey, the first systematic cadastral assessment in Korean history, was conducted in the dynasty's early years, redistributing some of the over-concentrated landholdings of the Buddhist monasteries and late Goryeo aristocracy, and establishing a new land tenure system that provided more reliable revenue to the state. The reform was never as thoroughgoing as its architects intended. The practical difficulties of displacing established interests were considerable. But it established a property rights framework that stabilized agricultural production and reduced the most extreme forms of peasant dispossession for several generations. The scientific achievements of the Sejong period were remarkable in their diversity and their practical orientation. The printing technology that Korea had developed, movable metal type, was first used in Korea in the early 13th century, approximately 200 years before Gutenberg's printing press, was refined during Joseon's first century into systems of increasing efficiency and quality. The bronze type produced in the royal foundry could print multiple copies of long texts with a speed and consistency that scribal copying could not match, and the dynasty's investment in printed books, distributing texts on agriculture, medicine, and Confucian ethics to provincial administrators and local communities, represents one of history's earlier uses of printing technology as a tool of state-directed education. The military technology developments of the early dynasty reflected the specific threats the Korean peninsula faced. Japanese pirates raiding the coastline, Jurchen tribes pressing from the north, and the need to project force along Korea's long maritime perimeter with limited resources. The development of early Korean firearms, the hwacha, a multiple rocket launcher that could fire dozens of projectiles simultaneously, and improvements to naval gunpowder weapons during the 15th century, created military capabilities that were, for their era, genuinely innovative. These technologies would prove their value in the crisis that arrived at the end of the 16th century. The Japanese invasion of Korea in 1592, the Imjin War, was the greatest military crisis in the Joseon dynasty's history, a conflict that brought Japanese forces under Toyotomi Hideyoshi to the gates of both Seoul and Pyongyang within months of the invasion's beginning, and that came closer to ending Korean civilization as a distinct political entity than any event in the peninsula's recorded history. That it did not succeed is due, in large measure, to one man and one ship. Admiral Yi Sun-sin is the most celebrated military figure in Korean history, and the assessment of his career by military historians from multiple countries, not merely by Korean nationalist tradition, confirms that the celebration is warranted. In a career that spanned the entirety of the Imjin War, Yi Sun-sin won 23 naval engagements without a single defeat against a Japanese navy that substantially outnumbered his forces, and whose commanders were experienced military professionals. He did this using a tactical system built around a technological innovation whose significance is still debated by naval historians. The Jeobukseon, the turtle ship, was an iron-plated vessel whose design combined offensive firepower with a specific defensive innovation. A covered deck equipped with iron spikes or iron plates, preventing enemy sailors from boarding the vessel and fighting in the hand-to-hand combat at which Japanese naval forces excelled. The standard Japanese naval tactic of the period was to close with enemy vessels and board them, converting sea battles into land-style infantry engagements, where Japanese sword-fighting technique was dominant. The turtle ship denied them this tactical option. The evidence for the turtle ship's existence and design is a combination of documentary, the accounts of Korean and Japanese contemporaries, Yi Sun-sin's own war diary, the Nanjung Ilgi, which is one of the most valuable primary sources for the entire conflict, and archaeological, with ongoing efforts to identify physical remains of the vessels in Korean coastal waters. The specific details of the turtle ship's design remain debated. The extent of its iron plating, the number and placement of its cannon, and the precise configuration of its covered deck are questions that the available sources answer incompletely. What the sources agree on is its tactical effectiveness, that it could operate within enemy formations, firing in multiple directions, without being vulnerable to the boarding attacks that Japanese commanders expected to decide naval engagements. Yi Sun-sin's most decisive engagement was the Battle of Myeongyang in October 1597, fought after he had been reinstated to command, following a period of imprisonment resulting from court factional politics. A detail that encapsulates the Joseon dynasty's chronic dysfunction in a single biographical fact. At Myeongyang, Yi Sun-sin commanded 13 surviving Korean warships against a Japanese fleet of approximately 133 vessels. The battle was fought in a narrow strait, where strong tidal currents created tactical conditions that Yi Sun-sin had studied and that the Japanese commanders had not adequately assessed. The Korean fleet sank approximately 31 Japanese warships and damaged dozens more, blocking the Japanese naval advance that would have allowed resupply of the land forces pressing northward. The human cost of the Imjin War was devastating. Korean population estimates suggest that between 1 and 2 million people died during the 7-year conflict from battle, famine, and disease, in a pre-war population estimated at approximately 10 million. The agricultural infrastructure of the peninsula was severely damaged. The social fabric of communities, disrupted by Japanese occupation, forced labor, and the violence of military operations, did not recover fully for generations. The trauma of the invasion was embedded in Korean cultural memory in ways that shaped attitudes toward Japan for centuries afterward, and that inform aspects of the contemporary Korea-Japan relationship. The political system of the Joseon dynasty was, by design, a governance structure in which the king's power was constrained by the scholarly bureaucracy, a system whose creators believed that the combination of moral cultivation through Confucian education and the institutional checks provided by a literate official class would produce better governance than unconstrained royal authority. It was an intelligent theory. Its implementation, over 5 centuries, produced both periods of genuinely excellent governance and periods of catastrophic political paralysis. The specific mechanism of constraint was the censorate system, the Sahonbu and Saganwon, offices whose officials had the specific responsibility of critiquing royal decisions, remonstrating against policies they considered harmful, and impeaching officials they found corrupt or incompetent. These officials had, in principle, a protected status that allowed them to criticize the king without the fear of immediate punishment that would have rendered such criticism meaningless. The Confucian political theory underlying this arrangement held that a king who genuinely sought moral governance would welcome informed criticism rather than suppress it. In practice, the relationship between royal authority and official remonstrance was in constant tension, and individual kings managed this tension in very different ways. Sejong the Great consulted his officials extensively, modified policies in response to criticism, and maintained a court culture in which genuine intellectual exchange was valued. Other kings, particularly those who came to the throne as minors or who were temperamentally unsuited to the constraints of Confucian royal governance, chafed against the remonstrance system, purged officials who criticized them, and undermined the institutional culture that made the system function. The factional politics that developed among the Yangban officialdom, the deep divisions between competing scholarly lineages and their associated political factions, was the dynasty's most persistent and ultimately most debilitating internal dysfunction. The four great literati purges of the 15th and 16th centuries, each involving the execution or exile of significant numbers of scholar officials by rival factions using royal authority as their instrument, created a culture of political caution and factional loyalty that gradually replaced the idealistic Confucian commitment to principled governance with a more cynical calculation about factional advantage. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the factional conflicts had stabilized into a pattern of alternating dominance between recognized political groupings: the Southerners, Northerners, Old Doctrine, and Young Doctrine factions, among others, whose competition structured the entire apparatus of government appointments, examinations, and policy decisions. A king who sought to govern effectively needed to manage these factions simultaneously, and the most successful rulers of the dynasty's later period, including King Yongzhou and King Zhongzhou in the 18th century, developed sophisticated strategies for playing factions against each other and asserting royal authority in the spaces their competition created. For the majority of Joseon Korea's population, the farmers, craftsmen, and servants whose labor sustained the state that the Yangban administered, daily life was shaped by a combination of the agricultural calendar, the tax and labor obligations imposed by the state and by the Yangban landowners above them in the social hierarchy, and the family and community structures that provided both social support and social constraint. The agricultural cycle of rice cultivation in the Korean lowlands, preparing paddies in spring, transplanting seedlings in early summer, managing water through the growing season, harvesting in autumn, defined the rhythm of rural life for most of the dynasty's population. Rice was not the only crop. Millet, barley, soybeans, and later sweet potatoes and maize, introduced from the Americas through Chinese trade networks in the 16th and 17th centuries, diversified the agricultural base and provided critical famine buffers when rice harvests failed. But rice was the prestige food, the tax medium, and the measure of agricultural wealth that defined the economic relationships of the Joseon countryside. The tax system that extracted agricultural surplus from the peasant population underwent significant reform during the dynasty's history, most importantly through the Daedong Law of 1608, implemented gradually across the 17th century, which replaced the previous system of tribute payments in local specialty goods with a standardized tax payable in rice or cloth. The previous tribute system had been chronically abused by the tribute merchants and officials who managed the collection of local specialty goods, creating opportunities for corruption that fell heavily on the peasant population. The Daedon reform reduced some of these abuses by standardizing what was owed, though the implementation was never perfectly consistent across all provinces. The status of women in Joseon society was explicitly shaped by the Neo-Confucian principles that governed the dynasty's official ideology. Principles that assigned women to the domestic sphere, required wifely submission to husbands, and restricted public roles almost entirely to men. The contrast with the preceding Goryeo dynasty, in which women had greater property rights and more public social presence, was documented by contemporaries and reflects the deliberate imposition of Chinese Neo-Confucian gender norms as part of the dynasty's ideological program. The actual experience of women within these constraints was, as it always is, more varied than the official ideology would suggest. Women of the upper Yangban class exercised significant influence within households and, through family networks, on the political affairs that their male relatives conducted publicly. Women of the lower classes often worked outside the home in ways that the ideology disapproved of, but that economic necessity required. The giseng, trained female entertainers who served at official banquets and diplomatic receptions, occupied a specific social position outside the normal gender hierarchy, and several individual giseng are celebrated in Korean historical memory for their intelligence, artistic accomplishment, and, in the case of Nonghae, during the Imjin War, their patriotic self-sacrifice. Gyeongbokgung, the Palace of Shining Happiness, built in 1395 as the primary royal palace of the new Joseon dynasty, was not simply a residence for the royal family. It was the administrative center of the Korean state, the ceremonial expression of dynastic legitimacy, and a physical argument, written in stone and painted timber, about the relationship between political authority and the natural and cosmic order. The palace was positioned at the northern end of the city of Hanyang, with the sacred mountain of Bugaksan rising directly behind it. The position associated in Neo-Confucian geomantic principles with the protective northern direction, and the main ceremonial axis running southward through the city to the mountains beyond. This orientation was not arbitrary. The visual relationship between the palace, the mountain, and the city was designed to communicate the palace's integration with the natural geography of Korea in a way that legitimized the dynasty's claim to govern a territory that had been defined by its mountains and rivers long before the Joseon state existed. The palace complex was burned and largely destroyed during the Japanese invasion of 1592 and remained in ruins for almost 3 centuries. The royal family relocated to Changdeokgung Palace, which became the primary royal residence for most of the dynasty's later period. The reconstruction of Gyeongbokgung was undertaken from 1867 onward, under the direction of the Hyungson Daewongun, the regent for the young King Gojong, as part of a broad effort to restore royal authority and Joseon institutional prestige that his administration pursued simultaneously with an isolationist foreign policy. The massive construction project consumed enormous state resources and contributed to the financial pressures that complicated the dynasty's response to the foreign threats developing in the same years. The Japanese colonial administration that took effective control of Korea after 1905 deliberately altered the symbolism of Gyeongbokgung as part of its cultural assimilation program. The Government General Building, the massive Japanese colonial administrative headquarters, was constructed in 1926, directly in front of and in visual alignment with the palace's main ceremonial gate, blocking the view of the palace from the city and superimposing Japanese administrative authority on the visual axis that had connected the palace to Korean natural and political geography for 5 centuries. The Government General Building was demolished in 1995 as part of the post-colonial cultural restoration program, and Gyeongbokgung has been progressively reconstructed since then, with the current reconstruction effort aiming to restore approximately 40% of the original palace complex by 2045. The Joseon dynasty was the most thoroughgoing Confucian state in East Asian history, more systematically and comprehensively organized around Neo-Confucian principles than Ming dynasty China itself, the civilization from which those principles had been drawn. Understanding the dynasty requires understanding what this meant in practice, not just as ideology, but as a lived experience that shaped every dimension of Korean social and political life. The suppression of Buddhism, the dominant religion of the preceding Goryeo dynasty, was one of the most consequential ideological projects of the early Joseon state. The transfer of Buddhist monastery lands to the state and to new Yangban families, the restriction of monasteries to remote mountain locations away from urban centers, the prohibition of Buddhist monks and nuns from entering the capital. These were not passive acts of religious preference, but active dismantling of an institutional infrastructure that had been one of the primary organizational frameworks of Korean society for centuries. The Neo-Confucian ritual system that replaced Buddhist practice as the organizing framework of Korean social life was built around the veneration of ancestors, the careful maintenance of family genealogies, the performance of memorial rites at prescribed intervals after the deaths of family members, and the cultivation of specific virtuous relationships between parents and children, rulers and subjects, husbands and wives, elder and younger siblings, and friends. These relationships, the 5 relationships of Confucian ethics, were not simply moral principles. They were the structural framework through which social order was maintained, through which resources and obligations flowed, and through which the individual's place in the cosmic and social order was defined and maintained. The Yangban family's investment in genealogical documentation was an expression of Neo-Confucian ancestor veneration and simultaneously a political resource. The documentation of Yangban status through certified lineage records was essential for maintaining the social position that examination eligibility and marriage alliances depended on. The production and maintenance of these genealogical records, the jokbo, the detailed family genealogies whose compilation was a major intellectual undertaking for Yangban families, generated one of the world's most extensive genealogical documentation systems, whose records now provide historians with demographic and social information of extraordinary detail. The Confucian academies, the Seowon, that proliferated across the Korean countryside served both educational and ritual functions. They were built at the sites associated with honored Confucian scholars, maintained their spirit tablets, and performed regular memorial ceremonies. The combination of educational institution and ancestor shrine was characteristic of the way Joseon Confucianism integrated scholarship and ritual practice. Learning and veneration were not separate activities, but aspects of the same fundamental commitment to maintaining the relationships and obligations that Confucian ethics prescribed. The Joseon dynasty's technological achievements are consistently underappreciated in the global history of science and technology, a consequence partly of the dynasty's relative isolation from the Western scholarly tradition that has written most of the world's history of science, and partly of the dynasty's own ambivalence about technological innovation, which Neo-Confucian orthodoxy sometimes viewed with suspicion when it appeared to challenge established social arrangements. The printing technology that Korea had been developing since the Goryeo period reached its most refined expression during the Joseon dynasty. The metal type cast by the Royal Printing Office, using bronze alloys whose composition was refined across successive generations of court craftsmen, produced letter forms of exceptional quality, and the bibliographic output of the Joseon royal printing offices was, by volume and by quality, among the largest and most systematic in the pre-modern world. The Tripitaka Koreana, the complete canon of Buddhist scriptures carved on approximately 81,000 wooden printing blocks during the Goryeo period and still housed at Haeinsa Temple, is the most impressive single artifact of Korean printing culture. But the Joseon metal type tradition represents a more technologically sophisticated and practically significant achievement in the history of mass information production. The rain gauge developed during Sejong's reign, the chogugi, standardized in 1441, was deployed across the country in a network of measurement stations that collected precipitation data from multiple locations and transmitted it to the central administration. The systematic collection of rainfall data for agricultural planning purposes was, at this date, genuinely without parallel anywhere in the world. The records produced by this network, covering several decades before the Imjin War disrupted the system, provide modern climate historians with an invaluable dataset for understanding Korean climate variability in the 15th century. The armillary sphere and celestial globe, constructed under Sejong's direction by Jang Yong-sil and his collaborators, drew on the Chinese astronomical tradition, but incorporated original observations and calculations that extended beyond their sources. The Chiljeongsan, the astronomical calendar calculation system developed during the Sejong period, produced solar and lunar position predictions of accuracy comparable to the best contemporary Chinese and Islamic astronomical work, calculated specifically for the latitude of the Korean capital, rather than adapted from calculations made for Chinese locations. What the dynasty was notably slower to develop was the industrial and military technology that would define competitive advantage in the 19th century. The philosophical framework of Joseon Neo-Confucianism ranked merchants below farmers and artisans in the formal social hierarchy, creating cultural barriers to the kind of commercially driven technological innovation that characterized the early industrial revolution in Europe. The dynasty's primary exposure to Western technology, through the Silhak, the practical learning movement that developed among reform-minded Korean scholars in the 17th and 18th centuries, produced intellectual engagement and admiration without the institutional investment that would have been required to transform that engagement into competitive technological capability. The Joseon dynasty faced existential external threats on two occasions: the Japanese invasions of 1592 and 1597, and the Manchu invasions of 1627 and 1636, both of which it survived, with its political existence intact, but its social and economic fabric severely damaged. The manner in which it survived these crises reveals both the genuine strengths and the persistent weaknesses of its governing system. The Japanese invasions, the Imjin War, have already been discussed in the context of Admiral Yi Sun-sin's naval campaigns. The land dimension of the conflict deserves additional attention. The initial collapse of Korean land defenses in 1592, Japanese forces reached Seoul in approximately 3 weeks after landing at Busan, capturing the capital before the court had fully mobilized a defense, was a military catastrophe that reflected the specific failures of the Joseon military system after 2 centuries of relative peace. The Yangban-dominated military command structure had allowed the army's practical readiness to deteriorate substantially. The examination system that qualified officers tested literary knowledge rather than military competence, and the factional politics of the court had produced command appointments that reflected political considerations rather than military ability. The Manchu invasions of the early 17th century produced a different kind of trauma. The Manchu, who would eventually found China's Qing dynasty, invaded Korea in 1627 and forced the Joseon king to acknowledge Manchu suzerainty in a humiliating ceremony at the Samjeondo Monument outside Seoul, where the king performed the head-to-ground bow, the kowtow, before the Manchu commander 3 times. The monument commemorating this surrender was erected by the Manchu as a permanent reminder of Korean subordination, and stood until the 20th century as one of the most painful symbols in Korean historical memory. The internal political enemies of the Joseon state were arguably more damaging than its external ones, because they operated continuously rather than episodically. The factional conflicts that characterized the dynasty's political life from the 16th century onward created a political environment in which the ability to outmaneuver rival factions was more valuable than the ability to govern effectively, and in which reform proposals that threatened established factional interests were blocked regardless of their merits. The Silhak scholars, the practical learning reformers, whose prescriptions for economic and institutional modernization were, in retrospect, exactly what the dynasty needed to survive the 19th century, were repeatedly marginalized by the orthodox Neo-Confucian establishment whose dominance they challenged. The external threat that ultimately destroyed the dynasty, Japanese imperialism in the late 19th century, was qualitatively different from the earlier Japanese and Manchu invasions because it arrived with a specifically modern form of power: industrialized military technology, modern institutional organization, and a diplomatic framework backed by the implicit endorsement of Western powers, whose own imperialism had established the international norms that Japan was now applying in Asia. The Joseon dynasty's peak achievement was not territorial expansion or military conquest. It controlled roughly the same territory throughout its 505-year history, but institutional durability. The maintenance of a functioning, literate, administratively coherent state on the Korean peninsula for over 5 centuries, through invasions, famines, political crises, and the pressures of managing relationships with powerful neighbors in both directions. This durability was genuine and remarkable. In the same 5 centuries that Joseon maintained continuous governance of the Korean peninsula, the Chinese dynasties changed 3 times, the Japanese shogunate changed twice, and every major European state underwent fundamental transformations of political structure. The specific combination of Confucian institutional culture, meritocratic examination requirements, and the geographic defensibility of the peninsula created a political system with unusual resilience to the internal stresses that destroyed most dynasties within a century or 2 of their founding. The 18th century, the reigns of King Yongzhou and his grandson King Jongzhou, represented something approaching a second golden age of Joseon governance, a period during which both kings managed the factional conflicts with unusual skill, promoted practical learning and institutional reform, and oversaw a cultural flowering that produced some of the most celebrated works of Korean literature, art, and scholarship. The Kyujangak, the royal library established by King Jongzhou in 1776, was a center of intellectual life whose scholars produced historical, philosophical, and scientific works of genuine quality, and whose archives now constitute the primary documentary resource for understanding the dynasty's history. The Silhak movement, the practical learning tradition whose scholars argued for economic reform, attention to the actual conditions of Korean agriculture and commerce, and engagement with the empirical knowledge that Western and Chinese scientific developments were generating, represented the most creative intellectual response to the challenges the dynasty faced. Yi Ik, Jong Yak Yong, and Park Jaega were among the scholars whose work addressed the specific institutional failures that were making the Joseon state increasingly uncompetitive with the modernizing world around it. Their prescriptions were sensible. Their influence on actual policy was limited by the factional and ideological barriers they could not overcome. The crisis that ultimately destroyed the Joseon dynasty was not the Japanese colonization of 1910. That was the conclusion of a process that had been developing for at least half a century. It was the dynasty's inability, beginning in the 1860s and 1870s, to develop an effective response to the twin pressures of internal institutional deterioration and external technological challenge that was simultaneously weakening it from within and threatening it from without. The Hyeongson Daewongun, the regent who governed Korea in the name of the young King Sejong from 1863 to 1873, pursued a policy of vigorous internal reform, combined with militant isolationism toward the outside world. His administrative reforms attacked Yangban privileges, restructured the tax system, reduced the power of the Seowon academies, and directed significant resources toward military preparation. His isolationist foreign policy ordered the execution of French Catholic missionaries and Korean converts in 1866, triggering a retaliatory French naval expedition that the Korean coastal defenses repelled, which the Daewongun interpreted as confirmation that his defensive preparations were adequate. The interpretation was wrong. The French expedition had tested Korea's coastal defenses against an 18th-century colonial power conducting a punitive raid, not a 20th-century imperial power conducting a conquest. The gap between what the Korean military could resist in 1866 and what it would need to resist in 1894 was enormous and growing, and the Daewongun's isolationism prevented the engagement with modernizing foreign knowledge that might have begun to close it. The transition of power to King Sejong and his consort, Queen Min, in the early 1870s shifted the dynasty toward a policy of cautious engagement with the outside world, including the conclusion of unequal treaties with Japan in 1876 and with Western powers in the 1880s. These treaties opened Korean ports, granted foreigners extraterritorial legal rights on Korean soil, and began the process of integrating Korea into the global commercial and political system on terms that favored the more powerful parties. The specific treaty provisions were unfavorable, but the alternative, continued isolation in a world where Japan was rapidly modernizing, carried greater risks. The factional conflicts of the late dynasty were amplified by the competition among external powers for influence over the Korean court. Japan, China, and Russia each cultivated Korean political factions whose programs aligned with their respective interests, providing financial support, arms, and diplomatic backing to their clients, while using Korea's internal divisions to prevent any coherent Korean response to the external threat. The assassination of Queen Min in 1895, carried out by Japanese agents and collaborating Korean officials in the royal palace itself, was the most dramatic expression of this external interference, removing the most politically capable member of the royal family in an act whose brazenness reflected the extent to which Japan had concluded that Korean sovereignty was no longer a significant obstacle to its regional ambitions. The formal end of the Joseon dynasty in 1897, when King Sejong proclaimed the establishment of the Korean Empire, replacing the dynasty's title but not resolving the substantive political crisis, was a desperate attempt to assert Korean sovereignty through a change of nomenclature that fooled no one and changed nothing. The Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, fought largely on Korean territory, had definitively resolved the question of regional dominance in Japan's favor, removing China as a potential counterweight to Japanese influence on the peninsula. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, that ended the war, required China to recognize Korean independence from Chinese suzerainty, a formulation that served Japanese interests by eliminating the Chinese protective framework, without providing any alternative security guarantee for Korea. The Japanese Protectorate Treaty of 1905, imposed on the Korean government under conditions that Korean historians and many international legal scholars have argued constituted duress, given the presence of Japanese troops in Seoul during the negotiations, transferred control of Korean foreign policy to Japan and stationed a Japanese resident general in Seoul with practical authority over the Korean administration. King Sejong's attempt to circumvent this by sending secret Korean representatives to the Hague Peace Conference in 1907 to request international recognition that the Protectorate Treaty was invalid resulted in Japanese pressure to force his abdication, which his son Sejong acceded to under conditions that the Korean court understood as coerced. The formal annexation of Korea by Japan in August 1910, the complete elimination of even nominal Korean sovereignty, concluded a process whose direction had been clear since 1895. The annexation treaty was signed by the Korean Prime Minister Lee Wan-yong, whose historical reputation in Korea for this act of collaboration remains one of the most condemned in the country's collective memory. Whether Lee Wan-yong had a genuine alternative, whether the treaty was signed under duress in a situation where resistance would have produced a military occupation with less formal protection for the Korean population, is a question that Korean historians continue to debate without resolution. The Joseon dynasty that had governed the Korean peninsula for 518 years ended not in battle but in paperwork, a pattern that the kingdom's entire history had established, from the scholar kings who governed by the written word to the scholar officials whose factional conflicts had paralyzed the political response to the crisis that consumed them. The dynasty had been built on the power of the written word, on the conviction that moral cultivation expressed through learning was the foundation of legitimate governance. It ended when the written word, in the form of an annexation treaty, proved incapable of protecting against the specific form of power that military and industrial modernization provided. The Joseon dynasty's most enduring legacy is one that is entirely visible and entirely alive: the Korean alphabet, Hangul, which 52 million South Koreans and 25 million North Koreans use every day, which Korean diaspora communities maintain across the world, and which linguists consistently identify as the most phonetically rational writing system in current use by any major language. The survival of Hangul through the Japanese colonial period, during which instruction in Korean was progressively restricted and ultimately prohibited in schools, and during which Japanese was imposed as the language of public life, commerce, and education, is itself a story of cultural resistance whose mechanisms historians have studied carefully. The underground maintenance of Korean language education, the preservation of Korean language texts, and the continuation of Korean literary production through the colonial period represent a collective act of cultural survival that directly parallels, in its method, if not its geographic context, the hidden Christian communities of Ryukyu or the tribal identity maintenance of the Pashtun communities after the Durrani Empire's collapse. The palace archives of Gyeongbokgung, the documentary records of Joseon governance that survived the Japanese colonial period and the Korean War, constitute one of the most extensive administrative archives from any pre-modern Asian state. The Joseon Wangjo Silok, the Annals of the Joseon dynasty, covers the entire 518-year period of the dynasty in approximately 1,893 volumes of official records. These records, maintained by dedicated court historians who operated under specific rules designed to guarantee their independence from royal interference, the ruling king was explicitly prohibited from reading the annals of his own reign, provide a documentary resource of extraordinary depth for understanding Korean political, social, and economic history. The annals are listed as a UNESCO Memory of the World document. Archaeological work at palace sites across Seoul and at provincial administrative centers has been ongoing since the Korean War's conclusion and has produced detailed information about the material culture of Joseon governance that the documentary record alone cannot provide. Excavations within the Gyeongbokgung compound have revealed the foundations of structures demolished during the Japanese colonial period, providing information about the palace's original configuration that supplements the incomplete reconstruction currently underway. The discovery of royal household artifacts, ceramics, metal objects, architectural decorative elements, in contexts that document their use and disposal, provides a physical dimension to the historical account that enriches the documentary evidence. The genetic legacy of the Joseon dynasty's social structure is visible in the contemporary Korean population in ways that population genetics researchers have only recently been able to document. The founder effects and geographic isolation patterns of specific Korean communities, the island populations of Jeju and the coastal communities of the far south, show genetic signatures consistent with the relatively limited demographic mixing that the Joseon social hierarchy's endogamy patterns promoted. The relative genetic homogeneity of the Korean population compared to neighboring populations reflects the peninsula's geographic characteristics and the dynasty's institutional patterns simultaneously. The most significant living legacy of the Joseon dynasty may be one that is rarely framed in historical terms: South Korea's extraordinary emphasis on educational attainment, its examination-based civil service, its family-centered social organization, and its specific combination of hierarchical respect and competitive individual achievement are all cultural patterns whose roots in the Joseon Confucian tradition are direct and traceable. The Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and SK corporations that dominate the South Korean economy operate within a cultural framework of hierarchical loyalty, educational credentialism, and long-term relationship cultivation that would be immediately recognizable to a Joseon Yangban official. The specific form of Korean capitalism is, in significant ways, Confucianism with a market economy grafted onto it. The dynasty that fell in 1897 was, by most metrics of the late 19th century, a state whose institutional structure was inadequate to the specific challenges that industrial modernization and imperial competition presented. Its failure to modernize fast enough, its political paralysis in the face of external threat, and its inability to translate its genuine intellectual achievements, competitive national power, are real historical failures, with real consequences for the Koreans who lived through the colonial period. But the dynasty that built Hangul, that systematically collected rainfall data across an entire country in 1441, that maintained the most extensive administrative archive in Asian history, and that produced in Admiral Yi Sun-sin one of the greatest naval commanders of the pre-modern world, was not a civilization in decline. It was a civilization that had solved a set of problems with extraordinary sophistication, and that had not yet solved a different set of problems, the problems that industrial modernity posed, that it had only begun to recognize when the solution was already too late to implement. The letters on this page, if you are reading this in a Korean script, were designed by a king who believed that the fundamental right of every person was to be able to express their thoughts in writing. Not just scholars, not just officials, everyone. He was right about that. And the alphabet he made to serve that belief has outlasted the dynasty, the colonial period, the Korean War, and every political system that Korea has lived through since. Some things outlast empires. The best ones usually deserve to.